So welcome to lot 76 cars on the Rover 45 2-litre V6 Connoisseur. With a very successful collaboration with the best-selling R8 200/400, Honda and Rover decided to work together again on a larger vehicle to replace the by now aging Montego, and this would be supported by a successor for the 200, which will be competing in the segment below it. The 400, which subsequently evolved into the 45, is based on the Honda Demani, and in actual fact represented their last collaboration with the Japanese brand, a partnership that went all the way back to the Triumph Acclaim. The project for the Rover 400, codenamed HHR, was struck in a deal between Honda and Rover in 1991. Richard Wooley, fresh off the back of the success with the remarkably styled 600 Accord derivative, was hopeful that he would be able to repeat this with the 400. Legend has it that when Richard flew to Japan for the first meetings with Honda, the styling of the Mani was already fixed and there was little chance to have the same level of influence that he'd had over the Rover 600, an Accord derivative. And in actual fact, his first sketches for Project HHR show a vehicle that looks like a downsized 600 and surely would have been very successful in the class. The reality at launch was a little bit different, and these are images of the first 400, the predecessor to the 45. In December 1999, under the ownership of BMW, Rover launched the 45, which was in actual fact a heavily updated version of the 400 saloon. It benefited from many styling cues from the Rover 75, and the higher bonnet line allowed the fitment for the first time of the V6 engine. At the time of launch, £17,095 would have enabled you to pick up this 45 V6 2-litre Connoisseur Steptronic. In Connoisseur trim, the vehicle was very well equipped with alloy wheels, as you can see here, and also in actual fact rear parking sensors. It also came complete with a glass sunroof and blind, and in addition to this, with front fog lamps and headlamp washers. It was a well-equipped package. Take a look inside. There's no surprise that on the door cards some of the switchgear is reminiscent of Hondas of the period, but look at the amount of customization that Rover's actually been able to apply to the interior. Those very comfortable leather seats and that beautiful leather has worn very well over the years on this 70-odd thousand mile car, and certainly a testament to the original quality. And side airbags are standard equipment on this model. Plenty of adjustment for these seats as well, although it's manual in this case. And the black on cream instruments really work well, and I believe these were also fitted to Rover 75s. No shortage of wood in this vehicle, and fake or otherwise, it actually feels quite at home. This central strip right across the top of the dash, around the vents, and you can see here below it the aftermarket Bluetooth Sony stereo that the owners fitted, and then we've got air conditioning controls and also controls for the heated seats. The column stalks are light to use, as I found out later on in the video, but in actual fact they've stood up really well to the test of time. The electric windows are handily located in the middle just near the handbrake, and there's also a really good storage area between the seats as well, and in fact it even has cup holders, which must have been a rarity at the time. Cruise control was a standard fit, and it's really easy to use, being well placed on the wheel. I'm not a hi-fi expert, but these look like tweeters. Rear seat accommodation is just as sumptuous. In actual fact, some people have pointed out that the space in the rear isn't that great, but certainly in my driving position, space in the rear seems to be pretty adequate. And it's actually not a bad place to be. You can see rear head restraints for the passengers as well, and obviously the same quality of leather that you see up front, and a couple of decently sized mat pockets on both seats. Like many vehicles with a Japanese origin, there's also a release for the fuel filler flap and for the boot down by the driver's seat. The boot's surprisingly large and useful for a vehicle of this size, giving 370 litres, which I still think would make it pretty competitive with similar cars today. Let's take a look under the bonnet at that remarkable V6 engine. Producing 147 horsepower, the KV6 engine was mated to a 5-speed Jatco automatic transmission with a Steptronic function. Any doubts you may have about the logic of putting a V6 in a small saloon car are dispelled as soon as you turn the key. Yes, it's only got 147 brake horsepower and 0 to 60 takes 9.5 seconds, but who cares when it actually sounds that good getting there. Common failures can include the failure of the thermostat housing causing the vehicle to lose coolant, need to replace the inlet manifold, and factor in the cost of a cam belt. It's not particularly easy to change apparently. The box left a tick is to actually drive the vehicle to try and understand why the people that have these really love them so much. I've been lent this car today by Joseph Lloyd of Lloyd Vehicle Consulting's channel, and the immediate thing that strikes me about this car is how smooth the V6 engine is. The seats are really comfortable. Apparently the leather used in the seats is basically something that was also used by Land Rover for Range Rovers of the same period. I'm not sure how true that is. I'm sure people will correct me if that's not the case. Belying the Japanese origins of this vehicle are the column stalks, which are really light and smooth and very easy to use. And you can tell the vehicle had a base in a Honda vehicle of the same period. The seating position, at least for me, is relatively high up. But what this does give you is a commanding view of the road. And certainly in terms of rear view, although the rear window appears to be a little bit pillow box-like, in actual fact, when you get in the car, combined with the seating position, the actual driving position in terms of visibility is really good. The ride quality is sublime, and probably a combination of period tyres and a softer suspension, but in actual fact the vehicle rides really well. And for a vehicle that's sort of coming up for its 20th birthday, you wouldn't think that it was actually 20 years old. There are so many preconceived ideas of Rover vehicles of this period that it's difficult, to be honest with you, to separate fact from fiction. But the reality is this vehicle was quite late in its life by the time this vehicle was produced, and probably had Rover continued in operation, it would have been replaced maybe 3 or 4 years after this vehicle was produced. Equipment levels are good, and I'll go into that separately in terms of my walk around of the vehicle. Seating position is particularly comfortable. Now I've been in the vehicle a short while, I can feel that it must be a relatively easy vehicle to live with. The steering wheel is an airbag steering wheel, but actually still quite sporty, leather bound, and with quite a chunky rim. Horn controls are on there, and also the cruise control is really well accessible within the steering wheel spokes. We need to get to the bends to actually see how this vehicle handles, so bear with me for a second and we'll find some twisty parts of the road to see how it goes. And the answer is actually quite well. Again, this is no Mark 1 Ford Focus or even probably a Mondeo, which would be the equivalent vehicle that the vehicle was competing with in period. But it still acquits itself very well. As you'd expect, that beautiful 2-litre V6 engine, although it's only got 147 brake horsepower to play with, actually performs quite well, although you'd expect a far higher power output from a contemporary vehicle from today. Noise levels, where I guess that at 30 miles an hour some of these rattles and squeaks would be exaggerated, in actual fact it's actually fairly quiet. When you really put your foot down, actually this vehicle picks up really well. These are not the best conditions to drive. As you can see, it's quite rainy and the road surface is not the best here. But what you can actually feel is the car feels really stable, really secure. It might not be a sporty car, but it's certainly a comfortable place, particularly now I've switched on the heated seats. As you spend longer with this car, you can really appreciate the similarities between this and Hondas of the period. Not just the obvious things like the plastics of the vehicle, but in actual fact some of the less obvious things, certainly that you need to drive the car to find out. In terms of handling, in terms of lightness of controls, that's something you need to live with the car for a while to understand. But certainly, were you to be blindfolding this versus a Honda of the same period, you'd probably recognise the vehicle as being Honda derived. As I've mentioned a few times already, although the power output might not be the greatest, in actual fact there are still reserves of power that you can tap into, and I think pretty much it would be a good motorway companion for those of you who are interested. But as always, the one thing I keep coming back to with this car is how smooth that V6 engine is. It doesn't make any sense as a business case to have a V6 engine in a vehicle this small, particularly one with only 147 horsepower. And it's difficult to understand, with the Rover 75 of the same period already being in production when this vehicle was launched, why Rover actually did it, because they had to make some fundamental engineering changes to fit this vehicle in. But I'm so glad they did. Conclusion, what's the Rover 45 2-litre V6 like? Well, for a car that didn't really have the business case to exist, in actual fact, it's actually turned out really rather well. This vehicle has a combination of smoothness, power, and a sense of occasion that other volume manufacturers of the same period would struggle to match. If you can find one and you can cope with 28 miles per gallon, now's probably the time to get one. There are fewer than less 40 of them on the road in the UK. So if you do see one advertised, stop, look, pause, and think whether you really want to rescue it. This is truly an automotive unicorn. Thanks to Joseph Lloyd for lending me his Rover 45. I hope you enjoyed this review. Please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.